Well, I am absolutely thrilled to welcome to the show Hannah Cox. Hannah is an American writer, commentator, and activist, and I'm sure as many of you know, she's the co-founder of BASEDPolitics. We first met as she was getting engaged last summer and reconnected after she recently got married, actually, so congratulations. And I've had the chance to observe her work from afar and see how, as your personal journey, Hannah, has unfolded, some things, in your opinions and in your work have also shifted. And these are mainly on the topics we'll focus today on motherhood, on work, step-parenthood in your case, and society's obsession with fertility. Just fascinating. Today we'll also dive into some lessons from The Handmaid's Tale, which typically find their way into the left. Um, but of course, we have all these individual rights at stake, and they intersect with not only one's work and perhaps womanhood or singlehood, but also our ability to be our fully creative and freedom-loving selves. So I welcome you to the show, and I'm just absolutely grateful to have you here on the mic, Hannah. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to join you.
Well, I'd love to start kind of with your hero or heroine's journey, if you will. Of course, you've experienced the dating world like many of us and eventually got married and kind of experienced gradually finding your way into step motherhood. What has that experience been like for you? Of course, we've talked kind of behind the scenes about that, but kind of, front facing with regards to your work. What's that experience been like for you, and how might have that shifted some of your perspectives on individual rights, being, somewhat of a libertarian or politically homeless, if you will?
hmm Well, it's a role I never thought I'd find myself in because I think, unlike many people, I had a very early understanding of myself and what I wanted, and I always knew I did not want to have kids. And that's something I've really never wavered on. And so when I met my husband, it was sort of a conundrum because, I fell in love with him so quickly and he was so complimentary for me. And the dating scene is hell. And so when you find somebody who's remarkable, you don't scoff at that. And so it was a really felt like a big cliff that I was taking a leap off of, even in determining whether or not we would move forward and I would meet the kids. And, ultimately we were just so sure about each other so quickly that I met them within a month or so. And fortunately, in my case, I had the exact same experience meeting my stepdaughters as I did meeting my husband, where we just felt like family instantly. We just were so well matched and well suited, and I fell in love with them too. And so, yeah, it became really apparent quite quickly that I was going to be a stepmom. And that was just crazy to me because I was like, I never in a million years thought I'd be in this situation. And, motherhood is challenging. And I think that people often have this idea that people who don't want kids don't appreciate mothers, and nothing could be further from the truth. I think we're very, very well aware of what mothers sacrifice and what they give up and how thankless the job often is. And stepmotherhood is no different. It's got additional challenges that are involved with it, unique challenges. I think there's also upsides. We have the kids 50% of the time, so my husband and I both say, like, we kind of have the best of both worlds. We get these amazing humans we get to hang out with half the time, and then we also still get to, like, take off for Japan, without kids in a few weeks like we're doing. And so it is a nice mixture for us. It's a nice blend. But it was still tough, as much as I felt like I really got along with my stepkids and they really loved me and championed me and wanted me in this role. It was still a huge adaptation for me. Like I really struggled just going from living on your own for most of my 20s and 30s to having three new roommates is tough in and of itself. I think just adapting to living with other people and their messes and their intricacies is a whole other level. So fortunately, I have a very supportive husband. He does the vast majority of the childcare. I get to really be in kind of a mentorship position. But it definitely gave me an even greater appreciation for what so many women do every day in this country. And it happened around the same time that the fertility discussion was really taking off in this country and like kind of creepy in weird ways. And so it's been really interesting to observe the, I would say, increasing fixation that the right has, particularly with women and women being in traditional roles, while I'm also kind of going through this experience behind the scenes, and while I also now have daughters that will be coming up and facing this new I think, even worse dating market with red-pilled men, and it's quite scary at times. So it's definitely made these topics take up a lot more of my focus over the past couple of years.
Well, I can definitely relate to encountering red pill men. It's funny because, a couple years ago, I'd say I would never date a Democrat, and frankly, I think I'll stand by that. But at the same time, I feel like I've met so many guys who have checked off all those boxes that I originally, had. But then we find ourselves in this whole new world of being red pilled, with again, not long ago I'd say that was a strength, but I'm realizing differently. And with the societal expectations around motherhood, and even just dating, that women are supposed to be perhaps less picky. It's tough, but it's also a very interesting time.
Yeah, I think women need to be pickier. I think they are increasingly, right? I think when we really have gotten to a point in society where I would argue, as a millennial, really for the first time, women did not have to get married. And I think for Gen X
Mhm.
women, legally and financially, they didn't have to, but the societal pressure was still so intense that I think most of them did feel they had to and didn't really see other pathways presented. Millennial women are really, I think, the first generation that have gotten married solely because they want to, and solely based on the character of the men that they're marrying. And what we're finding is that they're just not getting married, because
Mhm.
I think the problem that a lot of women are having when they do want to have a family these days is that the men don't want to step up and be equal partners. They don't want to have to take on additional duties. And instead, many of them seem to be looking for the same deal that their dads or granddads got. And women just aren't interested in that when they have free will. And I think secondarily, economically, that's just not really possible for many families in America either. And so I think that you do have this severe disconnect that's going to have to be addressed between men and women in the dating market. And some work is going to have to be done with men to, get it together, because I think that the data is overwhelmingly in favor of getting married, particularly for men. We see that they make more money, they live longer, they have happier lives. Men really do not thrive single the way women can, because they don't have as deep of connections outside of romantic relationships. And so it's really not a good situation for them. Even the ones who, men going their own way and who claim that they don't care, they care so much, right? This consumes their every waking thought. They're so upset about their loneliness and their singleness, and yet they won't change and adapt. And so I see this around me all the time. I didn't get married until I was 36 or so. And so, many of the families that my husband and I are around now, like, they've been married for a long time. They have kids similar ages to ours. And what's interesting is, in my observations, my husband is still often the only dad on a parent teacher call. He's the only dad that's like at a play date for the kids. And I feel very fortunate to have my husband, and who has that mentality and who wants to be an involved dad. But I think, unfortunately, a lot of men don't want to have to do that. They don't want to have to do their share of the child raising. They don't want to have to clean the home. And it's just a very unequal situation. And so women are right, I think, to avoid settling down and getting married when those are your options. That's not going to be a good exchange for women.
Well, and I think another disconnect is men feeling jealous towards women, and you've noted that as well. It's an interesting phenomenon. Perhaps that has to do with even financial freedom, because like I know I've dated men who aren't as financially stable or prudent as I am, and it not only like can it produce jealousy in men, I think it's also it can be kind of a turn off for women because, as liberal per se as like many of us are. I think at the end of the day, we do want someone who's at our equal or even maybe a little above us, because we're asking, which I think is pragmatic, what's in it for us. So as you've written about men feeling jealousy towards qualities that women possess, which financial freedom just being one of them, I think there's also a quote from Jordan Peterson that came up in my mind, which is just to paraphrase that the most dangerous of men is not like the so-called strong or even aggressive man, but it's the weak man. And a generation of men falling economically behind. How do you think, like just kind of from a market's perspective, how do you think that the economics shapes the dating market?
I mean, I think it's devastating. You can't have half the population failing to keep up, failing to launch, and society thrive. You can't have an economy that's going to thrive. You can't have a functioning political system. We see men increasingly, particularly younger men. I think millennial men were not like this. There were problems in the dating market, but it was not these. They tended to be pro women's rights and to genuinely like women. But these younger generations, they're being sold a victimhood mentality, and it's quite toxic. It's demoralizing. It keeps them stuck where they're at, and it makes them, disgusting people that nobody wants to be around. Nobody wants to associate with people who hold these kinds of beliefs. And so it creates a system where they are going to increasingly have to self isolate. And we already know that men are much more in danger for mental health issues. They're far less likely to go see a doctor, to get a diagnosis, to take medicine. They're much more likely to take their own lives because of that. Also, when they're single, we see that they have far worse health outcomes, probably because there's no wife telling them, like, go to a doctor. um, we all across the board, they don't thrive in the situation, and yet that is the only system that has really stepped in to fill the void, I think, of like absentee dads, not just absent from the home, but like absent in moral leadership. You've got these grifters and salesmen, snaky salesmen coming in to sell them these courses and sell them these ideologies and make a buck off of them, but it is just sinking them further into despondence and into their predicament. So I agree with Jordan Peterson. Weak men are very dangerous, and they often either self harm or they harm others. Men continue to be the top perpetrators of violence. They have a lot of emotional issues going on. They've been told their whole lives that women are more emotional, but that's really not true. Men are very emotional, and they've not been given the proper outlets to handle those emotions, to recognize them, to process them, to direct them, and channel them into healthy activities. And society suffers for it. Women suffer for it. And so I think it's a really bleak future. My husband and I talk about this a lot. My stepdaughters are still far too young to be dating, but we wonder, like, what is it going to be like for them to try to find somebody to marry or to have kids with? And it looks pretty bleak out there, and it's very unfortunate, I think. And then you also have the polarization with men moving much more to the right, and their beliefs becoming much further to the right on the actual political spectrum than right-wing men would have been 20 years ago. And in response, women are fleeing to the left, because why would you not? You're not going to go vote for people who hate you and want to take away your rights. But that leads to men and women being on like total opposite sides of the political system, and you can't have cooperation in that. So I think it's really a scary point in our society where we're at and what's happening. I think a lot of it is predatory practices that are happening online, not just the red pill crap that's being sold to men, but also the sports betting, the online gambling. It's the porn that's in their pocket at all times. These are really serious issues that are ruining men's lives, and that are making it to where women can't find good partners either.
Thank you for bringing up the porn piece. It's a difficult one to talk about. Of course, there's an argument to be had there about individual freedom and markets and whatever. But then there's also like arguments which, women have different perspectives on this, but some believe it is a form of cheating. I think the word unfaithfulness comes into play here, because if you have an agreement and one is not faithful to that agreement, you could call it cheating, or maybe more broadly or existentially, you could call it unfaithfulness. And we don't really have like an I don't think so. I thought we did, but we don't really have a moral framework or fabric that we're all adhering to. We don't have agreements like the word you use, cooperation. We're not, just as a society, it's a calamity for sure. I think I've heard you say that as well. This is not just like little disagreements between boys and girls, men and women, but this is a larger societal issue happening with both men and women. Um, and their men are not obtaining degrees at the same rates as women, interestingly, or at the same rates as they were in maybe the past 5, 10 years, and that affects relationships as well, I think.
Totally. And you were absolutely right in saying, like, women want at least an equal, if not somebody who's a little bit above them. And that is rational, right? I can't stand how the red pill community tries to make
Mhm.
that into something where women are gold diggers or women are hypergamous. Women bring more to the table innately in a relationship than men do. They can make babies. They are more likely to be caretakers. As I've mentioned multiple times already, men's lives improve on every single metric when they're married. That is not true for women. In fact, the opposite is often true for women. Women also have a lot more that they are risking in being in relationship with a man. Men are more likely to cheat. Men are far more likely to hit you or to kill you. Men have a higher propensity to be gamblers and to put you in financial distress. So these are very serious things that women are right to say, hey, if you're not at least equal to me or a little bit above me, like, what are you bringing to the table here? What am I getting out of this that I would not be able to get on my own? And I think that's a question that many, many men are not able to answer. And instead of looking inside themselves and deciding to improve and deciding to step up, they instead are, I think, falling prey to a victimhood mentality and blaming women. And I think it's just really silly. Women did not have equal rights fully in this country until the year I was born. Up until 1987, there were still restrictions that made it where women couldn't get a business loan without a male cosigner. It was, within my lifetime that we have really had true equality for women. And look how women are doing. As soon as you remove those blockades and those things that were in our way, women have not only caught up, they're running circles around men. As you mentioned, they're getting more degrees, they're buying more houses, their wages are quickly catching up, if not surpassing men. They are doing the work of handling their emotions and going to therapy. They're serving their communities, they're volunteering, they're going to church, they have friends and family they're caretaking for. What are men doing? And I think it's a really frustrating thing to try to counter when you meet somebody who's stuck in that kind of victimhood mentality and poor me, and they're used to getting coddled by the right because the right wing politicians have eaten that up because they're trying to curry favor with these men, and so that reinforces it. But nobody's hurting men but themselves. Men have every opportunity to keep up with women. They have every opportunity to improve themselves and step up. It is a choice. They're choosing not to. And so I think that's just a reality that we have to be more honest about and stop coddling them and stop giving people excuses. I've always had a very like pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality. And that's one of the things that had always attracted me to the right. But I think they've definitely lost that during the Trump era. And I think particularly when it comes to men. So I don't think it's healthy for them. And I don't think anybody telling you that you can blame the world or other people for your problems is your friend or wants what's best for you.
Let's shift to the Trump era, because this is not just, again, this is not just an interpersonal issue, not even one of the markets, but now we have this obsession by big government with motherhood and fertility, and this policy and cultural fixation. So in your presentation at Porkfest, which is where we met, you discussed society's obsession with women's bodies, fertility, and traditional motherhood. And not only did I absolutely love your presentation, I was fascinated by the reaction to it. Because the reaction to it was, people stepping up and saying, well, this is a pro-natalist community. And they very much made your point, which is, we should have freedom. Of course, if you want a pro-natalist community, if you want to have 10 kids, if that's feasible for you, go for it. But that shouldn't threaten your freedom or your desires if women either can't or just don't want to live that life. So what did you make of the reaction to your presentation? And I do want to get into some points of the presentation itself, but I just can't, I can't resist. But like, I never really got to get your thoughts on like the very intense series of reactions.
hmm I didn't even track it, to be honest, because I'm so used to it. And honestly, it was, I think, less intense than other pushback I've gotten around this subject. I have been speaking out about not wanting kids for a very long time because I felt like, having grown up in the South and in the communities I come from, which is, right wing, homeschooled, Christian conservative circles, there is such intense pressure on women to have kids. That is not new. The political pressure is what's new, but like the cultural pressure has been there my entire life. And I think I am somebody who just has always had a lot of self-awareness about what I want and what I don't want, but also just a lot of courage to live my life how I want to live it. And I truly don't care what people think. It might be because I'm neurodivergent. I really don't know, but like, you're not going to bully me into doing something just because you want me to do it. And I felt the need to start speaking out about that a long time ago because I felt like a lot of women don't have that same courage and don't have any support system around them to validate them. And so I think a lot of women get pushed into having kids that then have serious regrets. And what was interesting is when I first started making public statements just saying I don't want kids, I'm not having kids, it was I think I was one of the first women to ever do it, to be quite honest. Like, there was not this movement, there was no TikTok, there was no dink title floating around. Like, there was no discussion about it at all. And the reactions were deranged. I mean, just really angry, like crazy reactions from people. And I remember when Brad and I launched Base together and we were doing our show together, I would tell him, like, people's reactions to this are intense. And it wasn't until we talked about it one time together on an episode, and so he was getting all the comments too, that he was like, oh my gosh, people are crazy about this. Like, this conversation breaks people's brains. And I'm like, I know, it truly does. I have never ever said that people who, want to have kids shouldn't have kids. I think people should be very informed about what the reality of having kids is, particularly women. I think women need to protect themselves legally and financially if they choose to do that. But, like, by all means, if you want to have a bunch of kids and you can take care of them, have at it. It's a really creepy impulse that people have, where they care so much about what other people do reproductively. And I think to some extent it's like a knee-jerk reaction, because you had the, like, whole Paul Ehrlich population bomb sort of leftist cause for so long, where the left was really, like, ringing the alarm about there being too many people and overpopulation and environmental concerns. And so, almost just like a knee-jerk reaction the right had, where it's like, well, if the left thinks that, then we have to think the other extreme. And really, I think, probably the conversation per usual is, it should be more in the middle of both extremes. But they do just have this, like, tribalistic sort of attachment to the idea of, like, no, we're pro having a bunch of kids. But I think, moreover, the real thing is that the vast majority of people on the right have similar ties that I do to religion, and to conservative circles, that I think do have a vested interest, both camps, in keeping women in traditional roles and in having more kids, right? Without reproduction, religion dies, because religion already is dying. But people don't convert by and large when they're adults. We know that most people who are raised agnostic remain agnostic or atheists throughout their lives. And so religions need people in their pews to be pumping out more kids, so that they will continue to have a population in their churches and people who donate to them. So that's a very obvious motivation. And then I think, by and large, most men who are attracted to religion are often attracted to it because of the gender roles that are enforced, right? Like, if somebody's telling you, like, hey, come to our club, and our club, we think you're superior. We think that you should have a servant, and we think that she should have to do what you say, and that also she should clean your house and cook your food and raise your kids. I mean, that's a pretty good deal. Like, I think most people would probably take that deal. Like, heck, I mean, if I got that deal, maybe I'd take it. I'm kidding. But I get why that has attracted men. And so it's very ingrained in their indoctrination that they get, both from religion and from the political sector, that women should have kids. And I don't think people stop and ask themselves, when they're benefiting from a system, why the system is in place, or if the system benefits other people. That's just not psychologically how humans work most of the time. And so I think there is a, a real threat to power for both religion and for conservative hierarchies, that more women are saying they don't want to have kids. And I also think, lastly, people are a lot easier to control when they have kids. And that's true from, like, a government perspective, but it's also true in the home. I often look at some marriages around me where you're thinking, like, why is she still in this marriage? Like, he's not good to her. This is crazy. And then you realize, well, if she left, she'd, at best lose 50% of her time with her kids, and she'd have to provide for kids on her own, financially and physically, and, like, that's really hard to do. So I think having kids, women having kids, is something that really puts them in a situation where they're easier to manipulate and control, and where they'll have to put up with more crap. So there's nothing wrong with women having kids, but I think they should have them in the right circumstances, right? Like, with men like my husband, who is just an excellent dad, an excellent person. But I again think there's not many men who are stepping up in that way. So I think it makes sense that women are increasingly, not wanting to have kids. And ultimately, what that means is that the government's pyramid schemes are going to crumble, because they aren't having the replacement that they need to keep funding it. I say good riddance to that. Kind of love it. But that's why you see such political pressure increasingly, is I think for those same reasons. They need people to, like, fill the bottom of the pyramid, to take money from, to be wage slaves, and they need people who will continue to buy into their ideologies. And I think that without that pressure and without those vulnerabilities, I just simply think the proof is in the data. Most people are moving away from religion, and most people are moving away from extreme conservative views.
Thank you for bringing up religion. I hesitated to do so because it can be entirely, a separate episode. But religious fanaticism, I think, is an issue on both sides, if you will, specifically with Christianity and Islam. But to center the conversation on Christianity, because I think is more relevant here, um, it's interesting. Again, it's kind of like the reaction you got from your presentation, where people are like up in arms about religious freedom, but they forget that religious freedom also allows people to not believe or follow a religion. And like you, my lifestyle, my upbringing is actually centered on religion. So this is not, what I'm saying here is not a pushback against not a religious society, but one where ideally there's a stronger moral framework. I understand the tension and the need for that. I get it. But inherently, religious freedom involves a diversity of religions and not following one, agnosticism or atheism, God forbid. Secondly, I couldn't help but chuckle multiple times because when you had posted the other day that women who have children, maybe more often, are more selfish than women who don't have children, right? And I was just so excited to see the reactions. And normally I don't get involved in your comments. I'm just a spectator. But I couldn't help but say, I've always thought, even as a little girl, I've always thought, if I have children, I want it to be under near ideal circumstances. And that always gets taken, often gets taken, as it did in your comments, as, oh, well, the world's never going to be perfect. Well, the world's never going to be perfect. And sometimes kids are born, one might say, to co-create a better world and, enter the world in a beautiful and meaningful and effective way. Absolutely. But I think what I mean and what a lot of women mean when they say that is we want strong marriages. I don't think that's too much to ask. And if it is in this society, then all the more reason not to have children. And I'm sure now we're going to get a ton of comments, on here on YouTube. But that's just, I think that that's a fair, balanced, and rational stance. And another pushback that red pill guys will give is, well, women are the less rational of the sexes, but I know you tend to disagree with that. And men, in addition to bringing up rationality, they'll bring up strength and weakness again. Actually, in the same feed as when I saw your post, there was another guy who was actually interested in me, and he posted that most men like women because they are weak. And I said, well, thank you for your honesty. This is not an invitation to DM me, by the way. But he was all like proud of himself, like, yeah, people don't always appreciate my honesty. I'm like, no, I mean, thank you. Thank you for the heads up. that the main reason why you're interested is that you think that I and other women are weaker than you, because it's not the case.
Yeah, I would suggest that if you need your partner to be weak, it's because you are not actually strong, first and foremost. Very creepy, I mean, that's so abuser coded. I don't know what else to say. And that's several women texted me about that comment section. They said, man, the abusers are outing themselves. And they do. It's actually crazy to see the things men will say in public. And yeah, I mean, the idea that men are more rational than women is one of the most ludicrous things I've ever heard. Again, they only believe that because they don't count anger as an emotion. Men are far more likely to commit crime, to commit violence, to hurt people. That's not rational. Men are far more likely to give up and harm themselves than they are to go see a doctor. That's not rational. We could go through endless examples of how men are irrational in society, and I just think it's utterly ridiculous for either gender to assert that people are individuals. And I think individuals can be rational or not rational, and oftentimes, you can be both. I'm mostly rational. There are definitely times in my life where I'm not. That's true for most people. But I think that's just biologically complete hogwash, and I don't think that scientists would agree with that. So a lot of it is just like there's so much leftover propaganda from when women didn't have equal rights. And women are really strong. They tend to be the ones that stay and raise kids on their own. They tend to be the ones that pick up extra jobs when they're having to go it alone. Like, women are really, really tough. And I think that we see evidence of that in society. Women were held back throughout all of history, and within 30, 40 years are running circles around men in a system that was built for men. So I just think even that kind of argument is so not rational. It's so lacking in evidence and just self-awareness. It's wild to see people make it. But um, I think for a lot of people, they because they just had kids, they didn't really think it through. Um, they consider themselves to be selfless because being a parent's really hard. And I think when you hear people say women or men who don't have kids are selfish, to me that's a cope, and that's also a sign you don't like your life, because I think it's a misery loves company type situation where they're like, I'm having to go through hell and you should have to too because I'm having to do it, right? It's unfair. You're selfish for opting out of the struggle. Whereas parents who actually like being parents, you can pick them out a mile away. Like, it's become very easy for me to tell who's a good parent, who actually enjoys being a parent, because they will be the first to tell you being a parent's really hard. I struggle with it. You shouldn't have kids if you don't really, really want them. I love my kids, but like, this is not for everybody. They're honest about it. And I know plenty of people who are that way, who really love being moms, but they're the first to tell you, like, do not get pushed into this. I think a lot of people got pushed into it and regret it. I mean, I know that because they usually DM me because I don't want to deal with all the hate and harassment. But there's so many people who reach out and say, "I'm so glad you're speaking out about this. Nobody ever told me I had a choice. I never really thought through it. I love my kids, but if I had to do it over again, I would not do that. I wish I could have the life you've led." I get all kinds of that sort of feedback. And there's, now that this conversation has really taken off all over the internet, there's whole Reddit threads and groups of people talking about being regretful parents. And I think the thing is, that's very threatening to people that are already like not thriving. Because I think if you hear like, if you're not doing well as a parent, you're struggling, you're not really happy, and then you hear somebody else acknowledge that, I think it's like, crap, I made the wrong choice, and it's not a choice I can take back. And there's just a lot of anger, and I think shame involved in that. And I kind of feel for those people, but I think it's a much healthier place to be able to just say, like, I would have made different choices. I love my kids, and I'll tell them that they don't have to do this if they don't want to. I think that's a much more honest and like processed stance for people to have. But the people who have never really thought through why they had kids, or even more so the people who believe that, that have their identity and the fact that they had kids, which I think a lot of people do. I think a lot of people sort of give up in life, and like, they don't achieve what they thought they wanted to, but they, number one, have their kids as an excuse, and number two, they feel really proud that they had kids. They feel like that's their contribution, that's what they're giving back. And so when they hear that other people don't rate that all that high in their like value system or identity system, I think they take it as an attack on their identity, right? Like, if I wrote a PhD and I was really proud of it, and somebody said, I think having a PhD is worthless, that's probably going to hurt my pride in my accomplishment that I'm so proud of. And I think that's how the people who have kids who react that way feel, because they don't have anything else they're super proud of. And so when you say, I don't want a kid, I don't think that's a big accomplishment, it's not something that's a priority for me, it really undercuts their ego and their identity. And that's where the rage and the like defense mechanism comes from. Because, objectively, it is just a fact that having kids is mostly a selfish thing to do. And most people are not sitting there thinking, oh, having a kid's going to be really hard and I'm going to regret it, but I'm going to do it anyway for humanity. Literally, nobody decides to have a kid because of that reason. Not one. What they do is they say, this is something that I'll feel proud of. This is something I can, have a sense of pride about. This is something that I can do since other things aren't panning out for me. Or they think, I want somebody to take care of me as I age. I don't want to be lonely anymore. I want somebody to love me unconditionally. Those are all selfish motivations. Like, be so for real. There's nothing unselfish about that kind of motivation. And I also, by the way, don't think there's anything wrong with being selfish. I'm definitely an objectivist in that way. So I kind of reject that whole premise. But if we're going to use that as the talking point, then like, you are the selfish ones. Meanwhile, people like me who are saying, you know what? I don't really think that I could give a kid everything I'd want to. I would resent the child. I might feel like the world's not a great place. I don't really want to make anybody else go through what we're living through right now. And yes, the world will never be perfect, but that doesn't mean I have to bring somebody else into this. Those are pretty unselfish motivations, actually. And so I really hate that whole premise. And I think it's just deeply unhonest and unexamined. But I do think most of the time when you see people engaging in that manner, this is the first time they've had any of this tested and had any pushback. And so they're really sort of at their wits end, I think, in trying to have a discussion with somebody like me, because I have thought this through so in depth. And so they get very like aggressive very quickly.
I do actually, even though I don't have kids just yet, I do want to push back on the purely selfish reasons that people have. I have a friend who's doing IVF, and she's very like spiritually minded, and we have a lot in common in that way. And I would agree with her that if I had kids, I would want to make the world a better place. Like, and that's part of what I meant by near ideal conditions, is also like the near ideal conditions in my own headspace and my own reasons. Of course, as human beings, we're flawed, and maybe we never have purely good or even purely bad intentions for the big decisions we make. But I think it might be a little bit more complicated than people just having kids to have someone to take care of them when they're old. Of course, that is appealing. And I agree with you that there are forms of healthy selfishness. But it kind of aside from what you think, from what I think, from what my friend in Texas thinks, big government shouldn't really have a say in all of this. So let's get back to the big old bad wolf, the Trump administration. What ways are you seeing them attempt to or actually successfully exert control over women's rights?
Well, and I want to acknowledge your point, and I wrote about this in a piece on the subject recently, where I do think there is I would say most parents believe that in having kids, like their kids are going to make the world a better place. And I, I don't think that that's selfish on its face. I will say that, like, most of the time they're, maybe your kid will make the world a better place, maybe it won't. And that's the reality, is like you have to actually level with yourself. Everybody thinks their kid's going to be like the best and the brightest and the most wonderful. And at the end of the day, most people are average, and most people maybe don't do harm, but they might not do good. But at the end of the day, one thing without a shadow of a doubt is that that person will be harmed in being alive. I think there's just so much going wrong in the world. And so I guess that's sort of what I mean when I say, like, I still think that's a selfish motivation, or at least is based in, like, it's not narcissism. I don't want to take it to that degree, but like it is based in like this belief that, like, me and my genes can fix this world, or me being such a great parent can fix this world. And I again, maybe, sometimes, but I've also known a lot of people who thought that, and whose kids were definitely not making the world a better place. So I think that's why I phrase it like I do, but I think that's fair pushback. And I think that's fair to acknowledge. And I hope that they're right, right? Like I have every reason to root for people who believe that way to do so, and to have kids that actually do go out there and make a difference, and who don't create more harm in the world. But um back to the Trump thing, a lot of it's been more rhetoric so far compared to policy. Like they've suggested a lot of policy that I think is harmful, but it hasn't made it through. And I want to actually distinguish something, because there's something really weird about Trump where, like, to some degree, he allows his supporters to project their views of him onto him, and he doesn't always really share those views. Like, I don't think Trump is anti-abortion at all. I really don't. And the amusing thing, I guess I could say, is his supporters very much are, and he'll pay lip service to it. But behind the scenes, his administration at least has been quietly, like, completely shooting down every attempt that the wackier people in the party have tried to attempt over the past couple of years to ban milvopristone, which is the abortion pill. They've been trying to go to great lengths at the state level to ban it, to criminalize women who access it, to criminalize people who make it and who ship it to women in certain states. We've even seen bills introduced in places like Tennessee recently, by a total wackadoodle lawmaker there, to kill women who have abortions, to give them the death penalty. And that bill was actually endorsed by the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, which is just batshit crazy. And so, I mean, you've seen some things like that. You've seen some suggestions to have no fault divorce, because they don't want women to be able to leave, which is crazy, and used to get women killed. And then, we've seen, outside of the reproductive sort of cycle, in the big, beautiful bill, there is a new stipend to, like, basically give people a bonus if they have a baby, to create these Trump accounts. He wanted to do more, where he actually had one policy he suggested at one time where, like, they'd pay women like $5,000 every time they had a kid. Don't think that went anywhere. I kind of lost track of it. They've talked about subsidizing IVF for all. They've thrown some things like this around, but most of it really hasn't advanced. So I would say the real attack on women's rights right now has been mostly verbal, and mostly in directed in ways that are, like, a little bit more insidious, like currently in the Save Act that they're trying to push, which is absolutely a voter suppression bill and has so much more to do with things outside of voter ID than they're leading people to believe. But it will quite clearly disadvantage women from voting, because of the way that they wrote the legislation. And they're being very flippant about that. And they also keep trying to gaslight people and say that it's not true, but it is true. It's not that it would like most likely permanently block women from voting, but certainly it would impact many women's ability to vote in the midterms, if it were to pass. I don't think it's going to, fortunately, but you've got stuff like that. So I think at the time to stop something really bad is before it starts, and the rhetoric's enough for me to want to take action.
No, I think that's fair. And a lot of this is outlined in Project 2025, which again, I think is fair, to express concerns about and do a deep dive in. It's been a while since I've looked at it. When it first came out, I was actually at a party with mostly liberals, and I was a bit anxious to even go. But I was kind of thankful that like I could be kind of educated on Project 2025. And then we see some of this rhetoric come up in discourse. And yeah, I mean, I think it's even just to hear it at the government level be discussed and have this gradual alliance between sects of Christianity and or sort of bastardizations maybe of Christianity and big government, and see precedents set like it's not Chinese one child policy in practice necessarily, but we do need to look at where these things can go and how they could escalate, whether it's China. I think you mentioned India has forced sterilizations and even things in Europe that have happened. Fair to point to because for better or for worse, we do live in an interconnected world. And much of what happens, for example, in Europe is, it often finds its way into the US.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we can easily study on both ends, right? We've seen countries try to aggressively limit how many kids people have. We've also seen many other countries, including Western countries, try to improve the birth rate, and none of it's ever worked. We actually have a massive study that looked at all of these scenarios, and what it found is that governments have actually little ability to influence policy or influence reproduction at all. And if anything, there's a slight indication that when they do influence reproduction, it's downward. Which I think makes sense, right? Like if I lived in a better country, would I want to have kids? Probably still no, but maybe like I'd be much more open for it if I felt like I lived in a stable country where things were getting better and like where the government wasn't completely unhinged. That would probably be like the perfect, conditions as you mentioned that for which you'd want to have kids. And if you felt truly certain that they'd have a better future and that, they'd have their needs met and all of those things. So I think it makes a lot of sense that governments can really only have a negative impact. The truth is most people just don't want to have that many kids, and there's really nothing wrong with that. I think there's something really like completely irrational about saying like, well, we have this many people on earth and so we have to keep this many people on earth. Why? You don't. Like just because you structured your government badly doesn't mean you can't restructure it. There's nothing wrong with having fewer people on earth. If anything, I would argue that as AI continues to take jobs and as we continue to acknowledge that there's a scarcity of resources. It's okay if we don't have 8 billion people on Earth. We were just fine when we had 6 billion people on Earth, not all that long ago. And so it's this odd fear where people act like either you have replacement rate or extinction. And it makes no sense. It makes absolutely no sense. We're not going to get to a place where people just stop reproducing altogether. And if we do, it's because something has gone very seriously wrong. Like, be so serious. But for the most part, most people want to have 1 to 2 kids, and that's what we're actually seeing is that most people are happy with that. And the reasons that people had so many kids in the past was not because they wanted them. Your grandmother did not want all those kids. She didn't have equal rights. She didn't have birth control. Like she maybe needed kids to help work in the family store or the family business. Her grandmother had more kids because a lot of kids died and didn't make it to adulthood. So to say like this is what was happening in the past, we need to keep doing this exact level, it's such a like communist instinct to me. It's like a weird like population control tactic. And as I pointed out in my speech last summer, the only people that truly need there to be this many people are governments, religions, and then, to some extent businesses who want to keep selling their products to more and more people. But like there is nothing within a free market society that demands we must be at replacement rates to continue to have a good standard of living. So I always find it just really silly when we look at all of the work that's been done. They've tried paying dads to stay home and have paternity leave. They've tried subsidizing daycare. They've tried all kinds of things, and it simply doesn't work. And I think what is actually a good solution is let people do what they want. Let people have the amount of kids that they feel they can care for, that they feel like they can pay attention to, and leave people alone. It's just so meddlesome. And I think, again, to me, it always just points to like people who have a very unfulfilled life, because as much as people will try to claim in my comments like, oh, you're miserable and alone, nothing could be further from the truth. And I can't fathom getting to a place in my life where I was so miserable that I would be aware of other people's reproductive choices. Like, that's actually crazy. That tells me something's very, very wrong in your life if you're that bothered about what somebody you don't even know is doing in this regard.
It is interesting, right? Because as you've mentioned, I think it's obvious is men benefit more from partnership than women do. Partnership and especially marriage, financially, emotionally, and so forth. And I think maybe due to that, even on a subconscious level, men, some men, not all men, hashtag not all men, have this way of at times controlling women, attempting to control women. And one example that I was unaware of until I experienced it firsthand is the offer to be flown out. To be flown out, like if you're in separate countries. And I thought, oh well, this is a nice favor. How exciting! I'll get it on a plane just about anywhere. And then a friend told me, oh, you got to be careful with that, because then the guy can have not the ability inherently, but like the desire to control where you go, who you talk to, because they have financially invested in you. And maybe there's something off about the way my brain works, and maybe it's in a sort of masculine way. But I could kind of understand why, if you financially invest in someone. And usually, if you fly someone out, it's a serious favor, and it's with the hope of marriage or exploring that. So, between getting flown out or maybe even women being fearful of if their husbands might turn on them if they don't approve of the way they vote, I do think that societally and governmentally we do have a responsibility as men and women to take a closer look at the way power dynamics are at play between men and women. It's not to say that men are bad, it's just that biologically speaking, if you do acknowledge the differences between what is a man and what is a woman, just hormonally, now men invoke our hormones plenty, but hormonally and biologically, men are wired. Feel free to correct me on this, but my understanding is that men are wired to be more aggressive, and due to perhaps jealousy and whatnot, they do seem to be wired to want to control us. And it's a little bit perplexing unless you start to like rationalize it and understand it.
Yeah, I don't know to what degree it's biological and to what degree it is culturally programmed and has been accepted. That would be really interesting research to look into, and I might do it after we get off of here, because I mean it certainly is the state of things for sure. And this is, I guess, a little off topic, but this is a reason that the birth rate push is often coupled with like the trad wife push. And what's so interesting about the trad wife push is that it comes from the right and the left, and it's packaged differently. But like on the right you see these pictures of like women in sundresses, and like, why would you want to go answer to a boss when you could be in this sundress working for your husband instead? And then on the left, it's like sprinkle, sprinkle, soft girl life. You don't want to have a job. And I hate it. It makes me irate because I care so much about protecting young women. And it is a really scary thing to think that women are putting themselves in that position financially. It is, and it's not something that works out for the vast majority of women who do it. So I think it's a lesson I fortunately learned young too. I dated one trust fund baby like right out of college, and I was like, "Oh yeah, I'm about to have it made. This is gonna be great." And then he was psychotic, and then I just kept thinking like, "What if I was married to him? And I didn't have my own income and I couldn't leave?" Like, ugh. And from that point on, I was cured. I was like, "I don't care. I will make my own money. I do not need a man for that." Like that is for sure. And I continue to think that. I think work is good for people. I think it's empowering. I think that being a full-time stay-at-home mom, it's really, really hard, not just physically, but psychologically and mentally and emotionally. And that's why I do think more men should be stepping up in the home. And I just think, I haven't seen a lot of women who it's really worked for behind the scenes. And sure, it's alluring, right? Like you don't have to work, you don't have to wake up early. Like there's, I was actually talking to a friend right now who's back in school but about to go back to work, and she's a mom, and she said, it's been really nice and like I've enjoyed it, but also I'm getting kind of bored. I feel like I don't see adults enough. Like I need to like leave the house and have some adult simulation. Just don't know that it's really a natural way to live your life. And I think most of the time it's good for women to work. It's good for them to have some autonomy. It's good for them to have financial independence. And I think it does safeguard you from much of the abuse that can happen. And the reality is that if you choose to not do that, even in the even if you have the security of marriage, if your husband decides to leave or to cheat, which again he's more likely to do than you are, you don't actually have the safeguards, especially not the ones the red pill keeps trying to claim that women do. The vast majority of women do not get alimony. The average child support payment in the country is under $500 a month, which I'm telling you does not go very far with a kid. And then, most of them don't have any career built up. So the husband gets to leave the marriage and he's got his income that he's built up. He's got his assets. He's got, maybe to pay a couple $100 a month in child support, but like he's still where he's at in his career. Whereas you got to start all over from the bottom, and you're more likely to have to take care of the kids because men don't step up and ask for 50-50 most of the time. So, you're just putting yourself in a very vulnerable position. And this is why I think women are right to be very, very cautious about dating and marriage, because not only do I think women innately bring more to the table, but I also think they have a lot more to lose. And if you are not married to a good man, an ethical man, a man of high character, you are making yourself vulnerable in a lot of ways without your own income. And particularly once you introduce a pregnancy where you're going to need a lot of care and childhood, like you are just putting yourself in an extremely vulnerable position. And I think, if people really care about the birth rate, they need to fix that problem where like women cannot find enough men of character who are on equal footing as them to marry and procreate with. And they should not marry and procreate with people who are less than that, because you will pay for that the rest of your life. And like I said, I'm 38 now. I'm old enough to have seen this play out, by my peers and people around me, and to really have a better idea of like what marriage truly looks like behind the scenes for a lot of people. And it's not oftentimes the romanticized Disney cartoon version that we're sort of sold in our youth. So I think marriage should be treated like a business arrangement. You should be in love, you should love the person you're with, but you also need to be smart about it. You need to actually make sure that you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's. And if you go into business with somebody, you're not just going to give them total financial power over you. That would be really stupid. And I think the same is mostly true in marriage.
I think that also the intersection of politics and religion is also a fair concern, which honestly I see more on the left, because the alliance between certain forums or sects or bastardizations of religion, primarily Christianity or Judeo-Christian values in name, with politics is, I mean, it's like the Handmaid's Tale. I know usually that's what the libs say, but I might be the only politically homeless woman who actually has read The Handmaid's Tale and has watched repeatedly the series. So admittedly, and maybe I haven't voiced this enough, but admittedly, I do worry that with the rise of fanatical Christianity, Judeo-Christian values, if you will, and Islam, in the U.S. and the West at large, it is, it's a fair concern, because historically, and in The Handmaid's Tale, which is completely based on historical precedents, including in part 1979 Iran, I think we should take a closer look at how people tend to be worshiping political figures, perhaps more than Jesus. And I don't think I'm putting words into your mouth there, because I've heard you say precisely that. So where does that concern come from on your part?
Well, I'm a pastor's kid and I've grown up in the South. So I have been entrenched in the Bible Belt, and particularly in Southern Baptist theology, which I do not adhere to by any means at this point as an adult. But I've seen a lot of this up close and in person for some time. And I've never, I mean, talking when I was a kid, I thought we had too much church and state, right? Like I think that religion, well, let me say this. I think some religion can be good for a population, and that it can implement a moral framework and strengthen community bonds, and also step up and provide services where you need less government if done correctly. I think evangelicalism has gone completely off the rails in this country, and most of the Christians globally would agree with me on that. Like it is unrecognizable from the actual teachings of Jesus, and really just completely detached, I think, from the overall message that he was preaching. And so I think the lines blurred in this country a long time ago and intentionally. Russell Moore is a wonderful Christian thinker, formerly involved with the SBC, and he's, I believe, now left. But I really like Russ Moore. He's definitely to the right of me. He's very conservative, but he's a man of character. He went to seminary with my dad, and he I think he's like the editor at Christianity Today or something like that. But he stood up against Trump. He was one of the early ones that was like, "Hey, this is not whatever this is. Like this is not Christianity. This is not good." And then Trump attacked him, and then all of the Christians fell in line with what Trump said and turned on Russell Moore, which was crazy. And just shows you like they don't actually have. I think the American church is really weak for the most part. They're not really teaching them theology. They really are kind of, very surface level. And a lot of their pastors are very surface level. They're not very educated themselves or trained. And so in the 80s, I think the GOP really needed Christianity, and the line started to be blurred. And this is what Russell Moore has discussed in some of his work. And I think at this point, the average Christian can't tell you the difference between the teachings of Jesus and the GOP. It has become so intermingled to them in their sermons and what they're taught and what they're exposed to, and they genuinely like really are kind of in a cult is really what I would call it at this point. It resembles a cult more than it does Christianity. And I think that's very, very tragic and sad, and is a big reason why I don't have anything to do with religion anymore in an organized capacity. But it's very ingrained in them. Like they genuinely don't believe like Democrats can be Christians. They really do think that like voting for the GOP, following the GOP, is following Jesus, and so that's the predicament you're in. And they were already using that position throughout my childhood to do things they had no business doing. Like if you want to be a Christian, you're free to do that, and you're free to believe that being gay is wrong, and you're free to not have sex outside of marriage. But when you start using the government to tell other people they can't do that, you are literally no different than people under Islam who are implementing Sharia law, which you all think is crazy and wrong and scary, and yet you are the exact same thing. It's the same impulse. It's the same message ultimately. And so I think that has only heightened under the Trump era, where you really have seen like the Christian nationalism really get a even bigger stronghold than it had before. And I think it's very concerning. I think that here in America, I'm much more worried about that rise than I am Islam, just because I think you have a bigger concentration of the population. And also, when you look at our government and who our high up officials are, they are people who hold this same ideology. We don't have radical Muslims in high up positions of power. So, but I think both are things people should be highly concerned about. And I think you don't have to look much further than what has panned out in Muslim countries when it comes to women's rights, when it comes to their economies, when it comes to their violence. Their quality of life has decreased by every single measurement. And I think that's why our Constitution really didn't go far enough in protecting us from religion, right? We did a good thing in saying people have freedom of religion, but your freedom of religion ends when you start trying to impose it on me. And I think that we really need a better legal framework to draw that line.
I think Christianity and Islam are both rising fanatically in the West. I think understandably because of the alliance between Christianity in name and the GOP, perhaps we might be more concerned about that. But there are higher ups who are specifically of the sect of 12 Shia Islam. I think that's what it's called, 12 Shia Islam, which is the sect that currently rules Iran. And a lot of people are saying that we have effectively killed the Pope of Islam. That's not true. He was simply one of the leading Shia clerics, not effectively the Pope, and not representing even in name the whole of Islam. Just wanted to clarify that, not to like vehemently disagree, but just to say I think we need to keep an eye on both. That said, the Handmaid's Tale, I probably pulls from both forms of fanaticism. And there's a scene that came to mind when you were speaking about an editor of a Christian publication who I think was a man, but nonetheless, of course, we have female influencers in this space. And it reminds me of the character of Serena. Have you seen The Handmaid's Tale or read the book?
Yeah. I mean, I read the book a long time ago, so I know who
Hmm.
Serena is, but I'm not
Okay.
super up to speed. Yeah.
She is a fascinating character. She's kind of one of those like anti-heroes or villains that sometimes you root for because you think she's going to get better, and then she just gets worse or plateaus. But there's a scene where Serena and her handmaid, whose real name is June, but her what they call her is Offred, which is of Fred, of the commander in the household of Serena's husband. And things happen. The situation calls for June and Serena to take over the commander's office. And June was a former editor, and Serena was an activist, a Christian activist, concerned about fertility rates. She penned what sounds like I guess what would be considered in some circles a brilliant and well written book. But Serena actually contributes to her and other women's downfall so that she's not permitted to read, even the Bible. She's not permitted to write. She's not permitted to be her fullest self. And so when these two women, kind of unlikely allies from time to time, come together and they remember this time before effectively, I think we are also reminded as readers or as viewers that not only are the women who suffer as victim from these policies and this discourse affected in the long run, but it's also the women themselves. And perhaps I'm a little bit off about this because I don't mean to draw direct parallels, but I do just want to evoke The Handmaid's Tale as I think a valid nearly historical source. It's not just a work of fiction. It is, as Margaret Atwood said, fully based on historical precedents, including
Mhm.
fanatical Islam.
And I think you can see like those impulses by, women who are in like the trad movement now, or who are like, very into like the Christian nationalism movement, where I think there's often, we call it being a pick me. I think that that has become maybe too flippantly used, or at least not explained well enough to use it without adding to that. But I think like the pick me syndrome, I made an entire YouTube diving into the psychology behind it. And there's often this idea that like somebody who's a pick me is, just annoying and just wants to be like popular and throws other women under the bus because of that impulse. But I actually think more often than not, it's a real fear that I think that all women face, right? Giving our history and giving, ongoing threats that we face around the world and increasingly here. Um, where I think this is a wrong impulse, but I think there are always going to be women who think that by subjecting themselves, by falling in line, by sucking up to the men, by co-signing their own submission, that they'll be safe. And I think that you often, I think when you look at women in the trad wife movement, it's and I'm talking about the influencers, right? I'm not talking about the true trad wives, because as I've said for some time, real trad wives aren't online. Like they're all actually like, homeschooling and busy raising their kids. They're not doing this performative BS where they're trying to push it on everybody else. But I think a lot of those women, they really do think like, okay, if I just, perform femininity in the right way, and I have a husband and I check these boxes, like I'll be safe from these threats women face, and I, will be like on the side of power. And then as so often happens, they often get harmed in those roles, right? Like they get cheated on, they get abandoned, they get left, they get abused. And then that's when you'll hear them come out and talk about, sort of what it was like on the inside of these roles and structures. And so I think there's a lot of that in America right now, where there is, not as many women doing this by far as women who are opposing what's happening. But I think you do have a number of women who believe like if they, fall in line, if they join this church, that they'll be okay. And that's most likely, I guess, what that character would be representative of throughout history.
Perhaps so. There's scenes in The Handmaid's Tale too of feminine rage on display, and I think feminine rage and anger often gets mocked, whereas maybe, well, I would say male rage and anger, from wherever it comes from, even sometimes valid, is not necessarily welcomed. Of course, we're pointing to certain historical precedents that are outside of the U.S., but I think something that's inherently maybe Western currently is the suppression or the shaming of anger. But there's a lot to be angry about, and there's a lot. Um, there's reasons why we are at war with each other, and maybe those reasons are even, maybe we're not even sure of, what's happening behind the scenes that's causing it all. Do you find that there's a rational and reasonable place for feminine rage and, maybe even for masculine rage in the midst of all this?
Yeah, I think anger is a powerful emotion. It's one that I'll admit I rely on heavily. I've had therapists tell me in the past, like, anger is my safe emotion. Actually, I think I'm a little different than maybe a lot of women, but like I express a lot of things through anger, and I've worked on that over the years. I don't want to make it sound like I have an anger management issue. It's not that, but it's like instead of feeling fear, I will feel anger. Instead of feeling hurt, I will feel anger. Like that is actually what I identified most, and I think that's because I don't like to feel like a victim or to feel vulnerable. And I think there's a lot to be mad at in the world, not just as a woman, like period. There's so much injustice, there's so much oppression, there's so much evil. And I feel like the problem is that when you express anger at that, I think it forces people to look at it. And I think a lot of people want to keep their heads buried in the sand. And so, like, that's why you see this real pushback on any negative feelings or viewpoints that people express, but particularly from women. So if you say, like, I think the world's a really bad place and I don't think it's getting that much better, and people say, oh, that's nihilism. And there's nothing wrong with nihilism, right? Like, and I think that that's sort of like a cope that people have to make the negative emotion inherently bad. And it's not necessarily bad. It just means you don't want to confront it. You don't want to look at what I'm making you look at. You want to keep your head buried in the sand. You want to negate what I'm saying. And, to some extent, that's people's coping mechanisms, I think. And I try to be careful around that because I'm not trying to push somebody over the edge by like taking their glasses off and forcing them to look at things they're not ready to acknowledge yet. But I think that's the balance that like we're always sort of dealing with. And I do think that men have created a culture where like it's totally fine and normal for them to be angry, but for women to express not just anger, I think it's any emotion, negative emotion women express, there's like significant pushback and shaming over that. So I think if anything, it's a conditioning. You said earlier men seem to have an impulse to control women. I think that's a way of controlling people. If you tell them like you can have this range of emotions and opinions about things, and if you veer out of that, then you are unhinged or you're just an angry, like, mean person. And it's very diminishing and it's very dehumanizing, I think. But a lot of women don't learn to recognize that it's happening until they get much older and kind of start to have the ability to, or at least the strength to say like it's okay if I feel this way. Like you can't tell me not to feel the way I feel, and there's nothing wrong with me expressing that to you. If you hurt me, I have every right to be angry at you or to be upset with you, and you have to be able to deal with that as another human adult. And it's not my job to internalize everything and keep it bottled up so that you don't have to deal with the repercussions and or the reality around you.
I think that's fair. And emotional intelligence often gets pegged for suppressing your emotions or simply just not having them. Like control your emotions. Well, you also have to control or be mindful of emotions existing for a reason and what caused them in the first place. And that dynamic gets discussed often within the context of injustice, right? And even I've fallen prey to this where I'm like, you shouldn't act that way. But what happened before you act that way, you know? And the systems that are in place are, I sound like a lefty, but I do wonder, if I think this is fair to say, I think a lot of the systems in place are patriarchal. For example, the workday, the traditional 9 to 5 workday, is aligned with the cycle of the sun, whereas women's cycles are aligned with the moon.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually crazy if you really start peeling back the layers, just how much our society has not been built for us. From the medical testing not actually being done on women, to, what gets researched, right? Like we're looking into male loneliness, but we don't know what causes endometriosis, which is a horribly painful condition a ton of women experience every month and increasingly are being diagnosed with. Like there's just so many things that do still feel very unequal. And I think as somebody who was certainly not raised feminist, I never took like a feminist theory class. I didn't read a bunch of feminist literature. It's been sort of like really sad as I've aged to just start seeing, more and more of these things around me. I don't know how much it helps to focus on it though. Like I think that's one area that never I was never attracted to feminist really feminism and its theory. One, because I was a bit, I had my own head in the sand and thought we were good. But two, like I think there's often been an equal victimhood mentality that many feminists push. And I've made an episode on my YouTube of this too, comparing fourth wave feminism to the red pill men. I think they have very similar messages actually, and very similar impulses that I think are harmful to women. Like nobody is going to thrive if you're told you're a victim. And if we tell women like the deck is stacked against you, society was not built for you, men hate you, is some of that true? Yeah. But is it helpful? I don't think so. Like, I think the better thing is sort of how I was raised. Like, I think the girl power empowerment movement was getting a lot right. When I was coming up, we were told women can do anything, women are totally equal, like, sky's the limit. And I think because I fully believed that, like, I excelled. If I had been told something less than that as a young girl, would I have tried as hard? Would I have run as fast? Would I have, had the ambition and like self-confidence and belief in myself? I don't think so. I think that would have impacted me pretty significantly. And so I think there's a balance where like we have work to do to ensure that women's rights are protected and that we continue to carry the mantle of the women who came before us and who fought so desperately to give us what we have now. But I also think we have to be really careful about looking too long at the sun, because I think that it will burn your eyes, and I think that there's things that are within your control and there's things that are not. Like we are probably not going to change the 9 to 5 workday, but instead, what we could say is women should really prioritize careers that let them work remotely and make their own schedules. Like that's the kind of guidance I think really helps women. Whereas, if we say, things are unequal and they're so bad, and it leads to a place where all you have left is the rage. And is that valid? Maybe, but is it who does it hurt? Like if you just sit there with the rage, ultimately it hurts you. It's not a productive emotion to be stuck in.
That's true. I think in pop culture, perhaps one example of feminine rage at times is Taylor Swift, and it's interesting because you represented her management at one point when you started in Nashville. Is that right?
I was an
You did.
intern for her
You were
management.
an
Yeah, I was a little
intern. Okay,
peon,
not
but I interned
represented,
for her
but
manager.
okay.
No,
Yeah,
I was an intern for her management, and then I also interned for her A&R.
I see. Well, what contributions have you seen from her to womanhood, creativity, work, of course, and freedom? I mean, she has a lot to say as a self-proclaimed feminist.
I think Taylor's a really interesting case study actually because she gets it from both sides. Like the true like lefty feminist hate her guts and the right hates her guts. And it's I guess a really sad example of how like women just do get so much more criticism for absolutely nothing, and as a woman like you'll never just be able to exist. I don't really consider Taylor somebody who's like raw feminist. I think she has very traditional impulses. I think she's man obsessed. Like she's certainly male focused, right? Like she is a very male focused person, and she really has always cared a lot about relationships, and she, evokes that in her music wonderfully. And then she is also a very hard worker. She's a very smart businesswoman behind the scenes, and she wanted to be successful, and she certainly has been. I think she's a great example of like women can be both, right? Stop trying to make women one dimensional. But also how like it's never enough, right? Like it's never enough for the right unless she's just like a stay at home wife popping out babies by 30 and like completely like co-signing every conservative initiative there is. And it's not enough for the left unless she's like giving up her money, selling her jet, bashing men, becoming gay. Like they have a Gaylor, conspiracy theory for her that they desperately want her to be gay. And it's just, I don't know. It's a frustrating thing where like it's wild how strongly people feel about her, because to me she's kind of a milk toast artist. She's not a controversial artist. She's not somebody who really even is like politically controversial. I can think about so many other artists throughout history who have been like true activist in their work, and she wouldn't make the top 50, of that kind of category of artist, and yet she is so politicized by both sides.
And maybe this is a trite way of thinking about it, but I wonder if how, in part, why she is so politicized is because she's just a blonde American girl. Like, I don't know if especially the right, like they just want her to be more representative of the trad wife. Yeah.
Totally that. They felt betrayed by her because when she came out, she was this cute little country singer. Country is very, very conservative coded. And they assume you're one of them, right? They assume they have ownership of you. You're a white girl, you're a blonde, you want to be married, you seem like wanting to be married. Like they felt they owned Taylor Swift. And then when it turned out she was an actual real person with her own views, they felt very betrayed, I think. And the right has just become very tribalistic. I mean, always, but like under the Trump era, it is very much like you're with us or you are our enemy and we want you to suffer. And they just have this like really awful, sinister impulse right now where like they really hate, I mean, truly hate and want to make suffer anyone who's not on their political team. And it's gotten very dark, I think, in those circles. And then I think on the further progressive side, I think those people are equally cracked in the head. I think they're nuts. They're as crazy as the MAGA folks because they truly also have that same sort of like purity test culture where like either you're with us or you're an evil, awful person who doesn't deserve to, make a living and pay your bills. Like, I mean, they started that kind of cancel culture thing. And so, and their views are so extreme that like hardly anybody can even live up to their purity test, probably not even them, but they feel so self-righteous in them. And so, they are just militant in their opposition to anybody who is successful, anybody who likes, I mean, they truly do just hate men. I think I'm very critical of men for fair reasons, but like at the end of the day, it's because I want them to get better. Like I'm rooting for you. I really am. I want men to improve. I want them to turn a corner. I want that for men and I want it for women because I think I want women to have good quality partners. And but I don't think that's what and this is why I've never associated with like the actual feminist movement. I don't think that's where most of them are coming from. I think they truly hate men and want men to suffer. Like, they're what I was talking about. They've stared too long at the sun, they've let the rage consume them, and they're inflamed. And so if you're not with them, they consider you like an oppressor to them. So it's like I said, I think that's a great case study on just like how crazy both sides are because Taylor in and of herself is, you know, kind of a, and I don't mean this as an insult, but like an empty suit, right? And not in the sense that she's not the real deal. She's very talented. She's very smart, and I like her. But they're not reacting to Taylor as a person. It's like this image, right? And they're like casting and projecting their views and their issues onto her.
And Taylor, I'm not a Swiftie, but I'm referring to her by first name. Taylor very much owns herself. She,
Mhm.
whether she, she phrases it this way, I don't know. She doesn't want to be owned by the left, the right, by anyone. And even though is she married now? Or is she just engaged?
They're disengaged still.
Okay, just well, obviously she's not owned by her fiance either. Something I've seen her say is, "Sorry, was I loud in my own house that I bought with the songs I wrote about my
Yeah.
own life?" Like I just love that clip. Like regardless of whether I agree with everything or even enjoy most of her music, I have that clip in my feed probably for some for some reason,
Mhm.
but she owns her own house, she owns her own voice, and a lot of women want that or already have that.
Yeah, and I think that could be another thing that threatens people on the right is like she's indicative of the what women can be and do and have, and like she is a boss babe and she's happy and she didn't, despite wanting to be married, she didn't just pick anybody and settle down at a young age, and she's thriving. And I think that makes them mad. And whether it's because of jealousy, like you mentioned earlier, which I do think is a factor, more so for younger men. I think younger men like really want to be not want to be women in the sense of like they're trans, but like they want to be given the position they believe women have in society, like very, very badly. They want princess treatment. They want to be like catered to and coddled. And I think they're even, incorrect about what they think it's like to be a woman, but they want what they think it's like to be a woman. And I think that's why when they see women surpassing them, they're so mad because they feel like that women got something that they want and they did it and they got it in a way that was unearned, which is, not based in reality, but that's that victimhood mentality. They do have that kind of jealousy. And so I think Taylor is like a really good representative of that, of a woman who got to have it all, who they don't think she's talented. They don't like her music. They don't get it. So they feel like she's gotten something unearned. And I think that represents downstream how they feel about a lot of women.
It's so silly. Obviously, another intense topic that's in discourse, and I guess you could say sort of, um, yeah, a mainstream discourse, whether it's Taylor trending or unfortunately the Epstein files trending. Um, I think that's of course the Epstein files themselves are of grave concern, and they should be given every ounce of attention as possible, and justice should be served. Now, within the context of, I guess, women's rights or just women and girls, I've noticed, especially only on the right, is this talking point of, oh well, some of the girls, they were just 15, 16, maybe 17, a little underage, but is that really underage? Like, I find it to be so perverse. And then it's from this same sector of society that claims to have this moral righteousness under the banner of religion. Are you finding that too?
Definitely. I think that of all the like revelations I've had about like how society has been structured has been the most upsetting. And even in the Epstein files, like we saw I don't remember his name, but whoever the guy was that was overseeing like the clothing for Victoria's Secret Pink and like limited, like the clothes we were being sold. And you look at how like when I was a kid, and you're younger than me, so you might have missed this, but when I was a kid, kids' clothing, girls' clothing was very much sexualized, right? It had like words on the butt of all of our tracksuits, and the shorts and skirts were like itty bitty at Abercrombie, and like it was just such a push to be unclad. And like I remember it being really hard to shop for clothing because my parents were of course very Christian and modest and weren't gonna let me dress like that, and feeling like a loser because I'd be in like, not cool clothing because like everything that was available that was in was so scandalous. And now I look back and I'm like, oh my gosh, it was a pedophile that was like pushing all this. And you start to realize like the beauty standards are developed around pedophilia. Like they want us to be hairless, they want us to be itty bitty tiny and at a weight that most women cannot maintain without drugs or unhealthy eating habits. They want us to be small, they want us to be short, they want us, all of it is because you want us to look like little girls. And I think that that has been very radicalizing for me. And also I think being with my husband has been so healing because he does not like little girls. And so he's like, if I gain weight, he's like, I think you look amazing. And he's very like, he likes real women. And so like that is so refreshing. But being with him has made me realize how many men I was with before that did not like real women. And that made me feel like I was too tall or I was too heavy. And I think that that is just like a really big thing that women are deconstructing right now, and recognizing that like I- you know my gosh, like we already knew that sex crimes were bad, but the Epstein files has just been a crazy thing to encounter, as somebody who didn't even really think it was a true, not to say I thought it was a whole conspiracy, but like thought it was being overblown, I guess I should say. And now it's like, are you kidding? Are you kidding me? Like this is absolutely wild and we're not doing anything about it. And yeah, I think that it's certainly a moment to r- educate your daughters and like be much more on the lookout. And we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do in society to acknowledge some of these things that are in our culture and to prevent them from continuing. But I think that it has been really crazy to see people trying to argue that there's nothing wrong with trying to like go after teenagers and that there's nothing wrong with men who like much younger women. There absolutely is. They are freaks and they should be treated like that by society.
Agreed. And educate your sons too. It's honestly it's really exhausting and nauseating to, as a woman or as a girl, I imagine, to take on all this responsibility because men could possibly kidnap you and do all these foul things to you. And then even that, I think, without the balance of educating our sons and speaking to them as if, and as I believe they are, as already pure and good people. Um, I don't often hear kids referred to as people. They're referred to as girls and boys. We have adults and we have kids. Although the line seems to be hazy according to some, but it's odd to me. Like, for example, I have a friend who has a neighbor, and obviously, my neighbor has a husband, her neighbor has a husband and a child, and I find myself saying my neighbor's son or her neighbor's son, but he's also a neighbor. It's three people. It's also the neighbor, right? Like, I know that seems like kind of a weird example, but I caught myself saying like my her neighbor's kid, even though he's a neighbor. And I do think that some people believe that like we're born sinners. I'm not sure that's the case. I'd like to think that we're born good, and I'd like to think as long as children, boys and girls, are raised well, that that we not have another round of the Epstein files in 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, I love that you pointed that out. I don't have stepsons, so I guess I don't think about that as much. But I was telling a friend of mine, he's a follower that, longtime follower, and he kind of came out of the red pill movement in part because of some of my content, and has just been really thriving. But he's now, taken to like mentoring other young men around him to try to fill the gap and be healthy, a healthy example of male leadership and what masculinity can look like when it's at peak form. And he was messaging me the other day about like a young man he's been trying to help and just his attitudes that he had. And we were talking about like the parental failures there. And I said, it does make me so mad when people say like boys are easier to raise because they shouldn't be easier to raise. I think what's happening is that you're negligent, right? You're doing all this work to like make your daughter be self-aware and protect herself and look out for herself, but you're not doing the work of like making your son somebody who won't hurt people and who will actually protect other people and do the right thing. And I I do think that that's a really good point. We need to put a lot more emphasis on that. And, I think parents are really like doing a great job these days. I mean, we'll see how it turns out in a few years. But I think this is another component of the birth rate hysteria that pisses me off because, parents are so much more involved with their kids than they used to be. They spend so much more time with them than they used to. And they are so intentional. And, if you go on TikTok, you'll see moms that are like, talking through tough things with their boys and like giving examples of like here's how I tell my son about like these things happening in the world. I encountered one woman who was talking about how she deprogrammed her son. She realized he was getting into like red pill stuff. She was a single mom and he was like 13 and she caught him, and so she started watching the content with him and helping him then like push back on it and kind of saved him. She actually came on my show last year. I did an interview with her. But there's so much great work like that happening, and I think parents are, because they're not having a bunch of kids they can't invest in, they really are putting a lot more time and effort into the actual parenting and the instruction. Most of them aren't spanking their kids anymore, which I think had terrible downstream effects and had a lot of psychological problems we saw. So I think, it really does feel like parents are stepping up in ways that are really different than what we saw in previous generations. And I am hopeful, that we're going to see an impact from that. That being said, I think right now, any parent who has a teenage boy needs to be stepping up on this front because you're losing them. And I think there is just a negligence. Like, I don't think most parents know their kids are watching that content, or they don't know what it is, or they, are letting their kids on social media when they shouldn't be. Like, parents need to be really careful with the internet and their kids as their kids become, preteens and teenagers. But the current generation of parents with young kids, I see a lot of work going in on that front.
So, understandably, we've spoken a lot about what's wrong with society, the tensions between men and women, big government. But as the world burns, I think a lot of us are wondering, like, okay, what can we do about it? Um, what advice might you give to both men and women, and what action steps, whether with regards to a certain right that may be lost, or just in culture, what action steps might you provide to any of us who want to remedy some of these issues?
I mean, I think the possibilities are endless. I think the best way to affect change is as locally as possible, right? So I think if you are a parent, or even if you just have kids in your life, you're an aunt, you're an uncle, or maybe you don't have any of that and you don't want to have any of that, but you volunteer with like a boys club or a young girls association for kids who are are lacking parents. Think doing some work to influence the younger generations is really key. And I do think so much of the issues we're having are just from people who are like really misguided and searching for how to have a role in society, how to like feel good about themselves, how to grow up, how a person should be. And so if you can help influence that and train people and educate them, not just on like how to be a healthy male, but also on like how to stand up for women, how to fight back for women, how to change some of these constructs that we have in our society, then that's a really great way to have influence. Talking about these things online is a really great way to have influence. It's important that people hear these kinds of discussions and debates and perspectives. Obviously, politically, it's really important to stay informed, especially at the state and local level, and make sure that you are not putting candidates in who believe any of this crud, or who stand by it, or even who are just not deeply bothered by it. Like if you're a Republican in Congress right now that isn't trying to do anything about the Epstein files, or a Democrat, I think you need to go. Like you shouldn't be in office then because you are severely lacking in character. And so I think one way people can make a difference is just to start voting out most incumbents. Like, just go vote no. Just go vote for fresh blood because our political system is so bad that you really can't do much worse. I don't think most of the time. And then paying attention after elections to the actual issues that politicians push in your state and weighing in and letting them know like what you think about things, what you find acceptable. Showing up is a big deal. So yeah, and then I think lastly, just educating yourself, informing yourself, being more aware of the world around you and what needs to change and what needs to be pushed back on is, I think, where you really have to start.
Is there a certain piece of legislation that you're concerned about at your local level, or nationwide with regards to women's rights?
Yeah, well, I'm in Georgia, and so we have one of the worst abortion bans in the country. It was written and at such a way to where like women are essentially banned from getting any kind of help because I think it's after 6 weeks, they cannot get help. And so that was written intentionally because most women don't know they're pregnant before 6 weeks. But the problem with it is not just that I think that's unethical and wrong. I think that abortion needs to be on the books, period. I would probably be more open for a debate around 15, 16 weeks, perhaps, where um, it was only allowed for like health and safety of the mother. But our bill in Georgia is written so badly that they won't give women who are miscarrying treatment. I mean, women are dying. And then they've done some really creepy things too, where like because it's written so badly, the doctors and hospitals are scared of getting sued. They don't really have a good idea of what they can and can't do. And so they did this thing last year where like there was a woman who was brain dead but pregnant, and her family wanted to take her off life support, and the state forced her dead to stay on life support and have that baby. I mean, just really draconian, dystopian, creepy things are happening in Georgia. And so I will be voting against every single Republican this cycle that I can, because they need to be out of office here. That's something that severely puts women in danger in the state. We already had a very bad maternal mortality rate in Georgia. I think we're on par with Iran for that. So we have a significant issue in our medical system where women are already dying more frequently than they are in other states. But really, the US's maternal mortality rate is pretty bad across the board compared to other Western countries. And these kinds of laws, I think, are double fold bad. It's not just that it restricts abortion to a degree that is completely deranged and unfair. It also is hurting women who have no intention of getting abortions, but who are having difficulty with their pregnancies and can't get the health care they need.
Wow. On on par with Iran. Maybe those Handmaid's Tale costumes are justified after all. Well, thank you for the action steps and provides a smidgen of hope and empowerment here. Where can people find you so they can continue following your voice and your work? I know you have Substack, so not only do you do podcasts and social media, you do write some brilliant forms of long form pieces.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I've mostly
Yeah.
switched to Substack this year. To be honest, I have YouTube. I'm only dropping in occasionally to do the show. I just got to a point where I was really tired of being on camera all the time, so I've transitioned a lot of my work. I am focused a lot on Substack. I'm really enjoying that process of writing and thinking things through in a lot more long form format, and also just being in a community of readers. It's a huge breath of fresh air compared to some other social media platforms. So very active there. It's the Hannah Cox camp if people want to go check it out. And then I'm still very active across various social media platforms, Twitter and Facebook and TikTok and Instagram and, all of the above. But yeah, trying to focus a little bit more on things that feel good. And honestly, I just think to some degree the short form video work has gotten to a point where it feels like it's almost hurting more than helping because everybody's just kind of chasing the clicks. And I think we need to get away from that. We need to get back to actual discussion. We need to get back to really thinking things through. And Substack has been a great platform for that. So that's my preference at the moment.
I agree. I think long form journalism should be making a comeback because we have such complex issues at hand, whether it's women's rights or other things. So I will be writing a long form piece for the advocates for self governments on our interview and women's rights that are at stake in light of Women's History Month, which is when we're recording this. So thank you again for making space for a conversation, and please keep me posted on how I can support you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the discussion and appreciate you hosting it.
Likewise. Take care, Hannah.